the story I wrote a couple weeks ago about this case in Massachusetts with the student who was accused of cheating on a history project using AI. In a way, a local story. It's in a federal court in Boston, but we found it interesting enough where we just said, you know what, we need to write about this.
It's an interesting case. Yeah. We'll link to your reporting on this. I also wrote a Substack that sort of was a follow-up, very much inspired by our conversations. Mm-hmm. The last, and I'll admit I haven't actually checked in on whether there have been any updates. The last thing that I have seen was a preliminary injunction,
right,
that was denied by the judge. Mm-hmm. And I remember when we had talked about this case, one of the things that you and I both sort of agreed on was we just don't know enough. Like we have one side of the story, which is the student is, claiming that they were unfairly penalized, for cheating, when in reality, from the student's perspective, this was purely just a misunderstanding and, miscommunication or lack of sufficient communication from the school about, what constituted cheating. And I think there was a lot of reactionary outcry that was like, this is completely unfair. The student, shouldn't be penalized for the school just not being up to date or up to speed.
Not having a good policy.
But when I read the preliminary injunction, the judge actually quoted specific excerpts from the school academic integrity policy where they say, you're not supposed to use, technology. Mm-hmm. And they ensure they don't necessarily specifically name artificial intelligence, but so there was even the out of date academic integrity policy, I think arguably did cover it. Mm-hmm. But then the other sort of detail that I think was lost in some of the national coverage is the school had actually had a whole class where they talked about appropriate and inappropriate uses of ChatGPT.
Right. It was an English class, I think.
It was an English class.
And just for the record, the kid had been punished in a history class.
Yeah, and okay. So what basically the case kind of evolved into was, to me, very clearly the student cheated. Mm-hmm. And this was basically a semantic argument about whether, a policy in an English class is transferable to a social studies class. And, I'm not a student of the law, and I don't know exactly, I don't believe that there's been a ruling yet in the case. Mm-hmm. The judge seems pretty aligned with the school based on his commentary in the denial of the injunction. But I actually think that school in Massachusetts is an exemplar of what most schools should be doing. Mm-hmm. And sure, maybe I think there's probably a little bit of constructive feedback in terms of over communicating in this moment is always good. And if you're and it probably does make sense to clearly update your policies school-wide and be really intentional about letting kids know. But I also think that as a student, there is there's these gray areas even before ChatGPT. I mean, one of the points that I make when people ask, well, ChatGPT shouldn't be cheating because the student is just, using a tool. One of the questions I'll ask, and I'll be curious for your take on this, is imagine a student's writing an essay and it's an essay on Cold War history, and their parent is a professor of Cold War history.
I know where you're going with this, by the way.
And while they're writing the essay, their parent is sitting right next to them.
Right.
And, maybe not literally writing it, but helping them write every single thing, provide them with all this feedback, mm-hmm. Not just reviewing it and providing red lines, actually co-writing it with the student.
Right. Or there's a sculpture project and their dad's a sculptor.
Yeah. I mean, is that cheating? I mean, I if you were the teacher in that situation.
No, I think it's a great question, and I think to me the kind of the short answer to that, the short response is, transparency says you should indicate that I got help from my mom, who's a Cold War historian, or here are the contributions that she was able to offer. And it's interesting because I think a good teacher maybe this goes back to, kind of like basic principles. Like a good teacher would probably know, like, Alex's mom is a Cold War historian, so he's going to write a killer paper on, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think in a way, maybe that's beyond the pale for most teachers. Maybe they don't need to know that much about their students, but it's probably a good, smart teacher would know that. It's kind of the same thing. I think you should be able to expect from your students a kind of transparency about their work and their sources and the advantages they've got.
Because the student
Right.
didn't appropriately cite their
Right.
use of ChatGPT. And that was one of the things that they had covered in English class was, first of all, if you're going to use ChatGPT, you have to, I forget exactly how they framed it, but it was like the spirit was, you can't just type in one sentence and press enter.
Right.
Like the goal is that you're, and if you're going to use it, like you have to cite it just in the same way that you'd cite an encyclopedia or some other sort of like online technology-based information product. And so I think that there is, but there's generally not, I think the point with the parent is there's not a right answer, but there is sort of the goal of education, the goal of an assignment is ultimately a student, sort of this like sort of productive struggle.
Yeah.
And I think this is where I'm very biased towards teachers in the debate about whether ChatGPT is cheating because the answer is it's complicated, but ultimately I think teachers actually have an instinct. And to your point, teachers know their students and like they generally have a sense for whether something is like, kind of wildly out of scope of what that student was able to do. And I think the challenge is the parents, students are looking for sort of a blanket answer to a question that I think society and industry has not even really quite answered because we have not figured out, I have not seen any company that has like really honed in on what does it look like for humans and language models to sort of co-create together. And so in this moment where we're actually figuring this out together, I think there needs to be some latitude.
And I think you're right. And another way of thinking about productive struggle is, effortful thinking, right? This is what school is about, right? This is basically practice for your brain, solving these problems. And I think if we're relying on a technology just to get the student to the end of the assignment, then we've lost the narrative. And to assume that kids aren't going to do that is naive.
And another reaction is, well, if students are cheating, it's simply because the assignment it's out of date. And I think there was an assumption that this was just sort of a standard book report.
Right.
But again, in the judge's denial of the preliminary injunction, so more was revealed about sort of the nature of the assignment.
Yeah.
And my understanding is the student got to choose the topic.
Right.
They were working in groups.
Right.
So a lot of components that we would actually generally advise teachers, like how do you design assignments and work that is more meaningful to students. I mean, there was a lot of agency provided to students and it was also multifaceted. And interestingly, the reason the student got such a bad score on that assignment was because it wasn't even the final assignment that was turned in. It was the research and the outline, because I think the teacher's mindset was there were a few different ways that they could present what they learned. And so rather than grading everybody on just sort of like whether their PowerPoint was good or whether their report or their write-up was good, they were focusing on the process of gathering the knowledge, right? And so that's again like something that that's advice that we often give teachers is, you have to focus less on the work product and more on the process.
Right.
So could the assignment have been honed? Perhaps, but again, I find this an example of even when teachers in schools are doing everything right, kids are crafty, and I think there's I guess you should get maybe some points for trying. I think this was a little bit
ham-handed.
Yeah, I guess it was ham-handed. I guess there's also a concern that teachers that and I think this is actually reality. I think some teachers are incredulous at the idea that students would cheat. And so rather than interrogating, this is actually Victor Lee's research out of Stanford, and Victor's research, which I want to talk about, by the way, found that incidents of cheating post ChatGPT have not increased. And the hypothesis is that students are always going to use sort of like the latest tools to cheat. Like when I was in high school, we had our lunchrooms were these round tables, and so before our AP European history class with Mrs. Giannini, we kind of had a pact where like at least one person would have the homework done, and everybody would sort of pass the sheet around and sort of like copy the answers.
Okay.
And that was sort of an old school. That was like pre social media, and now students have TikTok and other
copy
other
and
forms.
paste. Your early copy and paste.
So I think part of the argument is that teachers are always going to. The worry is that teachers are taking it personally, that it's an affront to them that students would cheat. When researchers like Victor Lee would say, teachers need to create learning experiences that students, sort of inherently understand and connect with their own world and that are meaningful.
Right. I love the word. I love the word. I've seen in a number of instances around this, the word artifacts, because I think to me, it's a powerful word. It's like, what are the artifacts you want as a teacher? Is it just, in Alex's history class, you just want, 8 questions answered, and if everybody gets the right, if everybody copies and pastes the right answer, then the work is done. Is that a satisfactory artifact, or do you want a different kind of artifact? Do you want something where, individualism is essential? And I think we're coming up against that in terms of like what do teachers feel is like the satisfactory proof of learning? And in a way, like I hate to say it, this is a really interesting conversation for teachers to have, and for parents to have, and for students to have. So maybe like maybe this technology has really like forced that upon us. So let's do it. Let's have that conversation. I mean, we certainly weren't having this conversation 10, 15 years ago.
That's right.
So in a way, progress is upon us.